All right, joining us right now, gaming and sports law attorney, co-host of the Conduct Pod, at Conduct Pod on Twitter, Daniel Wallach. You can also follow him on Twitter, at Wallach Legal. Andy Gresh here in Providence. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. What a euphoric day, huh?
Well, look, I want sports gaming. I'm so glad the Supreme Court took this up. Two things. Are you surprised the Supreme Court is going to look at this, and what could come from it?
Well, the surprise is only that it took so long, and let me explain why. The Supreme Court takes very few cases up, to the highest level, maybe less than 30 each year. But this one had some constitutional, questions that are, in the court's wheelhouse for, in terms of being interested in issues concerning federal and state sovereignty, 10th Amendment type issues. This isn't about sports betting so much as it is a question of how far the federal government can restrain states from regulating its own citizens with regard to private behavior. I know it sounds like kind of an esoteric concept, but that's the pathway, for cases like sports betting and marijuana, for example, to catch the court's attention. So sports betting was the vehicle, and I think there's a high likelihood that the court is going to invalidate PASPA on constitutional grounds. How soon this could happen? I think we're looking at probably by June of 2018. Look, it's a long way away. The decision might go the other way, too, but at least 4 justices of the Supreme Court viewed this issue as worthy of their time. And since the Third Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals is the only court in the country that has addressed this particular question, when there's just one court as opposed to having to resolve a dispute among competing courts on the lower level, I think there's a greater likelihood of a reversal by the Supreme Court when they're looking at just one court's decision as opposed to resolving a split among the circuit courts.
So, Daniel, for those who don't understand it, how does the process work? Who argues for? Who argues against? Is it just up to the judges? What's the process?
It's like, I guess, for non-lawyers, it's like it's hard to describe the process. It's an appellate oral argument where an hour is devoted to the two sides. The New Jersey party will get 30 minutes to make their case to the 9 justices, and the professional sports leagues will get 30 minutes to present the counter to New Jersey's position. At the same time, the federal government, through the U.S. Solicitor General's office, may reserve some time. But altogether, we're looking at a 1-hour oral argument, which could take place at any time. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but the court usually conducts oral arguments between October and April. So somewhere within that 7-month window, we're going to have an oral argument. Before we even get to oral argument, the two sides have to brief the issues and submit extensive legal argumentation to the court in the form of opening briefs, response briefs, reply briefs. So the next 3 to 4 months is going to be pretty much tied up in written, legal argument. And then after the court gets all of the final papers, it will schedule an oral argument. And I would expect the oral argument to be somewhere in the window of maybe January or February.
Daniel Wallach, gaming and sports law attorney here on the Gresh Show on WPRO. How could this potentially impact daily fantasy sports companies?
Well, think about it. Daily fantasy sports has had a monopoly on sports gaming in the United States over the last 5 years. If you can't bet on single game, single sporting events and traditional sports betting, unless you're in Nevada, the only way that fans can gamble legally, although that's sort of a tricky question, but daily fantasy sports represented the only, category of sports gambling that was legally permissible in most states. And it's a very difficult game to play compared to traditional sports betting. Anybody can bet against the line, favorite, underdog, in-play gambling. Fantasy sports is kind of more complicated and it requires statistical analysis, drafting a team under a salary cap format. I think the DFS industry will be hard hit by the proliferation of traditional sports betting. And over the course of the next, 3 to 5 years, as sports gambling becomes a little bit more mainstream, I think DFS will have a very difficult time surviving in that current, in that future environment, except as a niche product.
So if the courts rule for sports gambling, then what happens and how long do you think it takes governments, states to be able to come up with how to get their slice of the pie? I mean, basically, if the Supreme Court rules that we all should be allowed to bet, how long will it actually take for it to be implemented before we can go to, like, a casino in Rhode Island and place a sports wager?
Well, for a state like New Jersey, it's going to be right away, because New Jersey already has enacted a legal regime that's now under, I guess that was challenged by the federal government. So what you're going to see states start doing now that the Supreme Court has accepted the case for review, you're going to see other states start to enact laws that allow sports betting to take place immediately upon the Supreme Court overturning the federal ban on sports betting, or if Congress repeals the law. I call these kind of placeholder laws. So I think you're going to start, a few states have already introduced bills along those lines. Rhode Island is not one of them. Massachusetts is not another, but Connecticut is one. And by this time next year, I think a large number of states may have, bills that are ready to be activated if and when the Supreme Court overturns PASPA. And in that instance, those states will be able to go ahead right away.
As you look at the actual case itself, what do you think will be the sticking point for the judges? And is there, boy, this is a real detailed question from, I think, from a sports end, but are there certain judges on the panel who may end up either being a swing vote or key to all of us being able to bet at some point soon?
Yeah, I guess the conventional wisdom whenever it comes to swing votes is Justice Anthony Kennedy, who traditionally is the swing vote that separates the conservative wing from the liberal wing of the court. But I don't necessarily see this case being decided on ideological lines, although the controversy of federal overreach into state sovereignty is a favorite issue of conservative judges and conservative legal thinkers. So to the extent that this is an issue of federalism that appeals to conservative-minded judges, this is an issue that would carry at least 4 judges on this court and potentially a 5th. So the overarching constitutional issues, I think, would play out very well in New Jersey's favor, given the composition of the court. Now, from a sports angle, one of the questions that the court, and not limited to a particular justice, the question that the court might have is, how can the sports leagues claim that they would be harmed by sports gambling when they're moving franchises to Las Vegas and they're making inroads in the gambling business? More importantly, with respect to PASPA, the question is, how can the leagues enforce PASPA against states that try to legalize sports betting, but not invoke PASPA against daily fantasy sports? There's a selective enforcement in the way that the professional sports leagues use this federal law conveniently to block betting that might be in competition with some of its business interests. So there's a real question over whether the leagues have too much power under this federal law to impose it, and whether it is an unconstitutional delegation of power to the professional sports league. Now, that issue has been raised in the case, and I think you're going to see a number of issues, teed up in the legal briefs, but we won't know until oral argument which issues capture the court's attention. But the DFS angle is one that's very intriguing to me.
You can follow Daniel Wallach on Twitter at Wallach Legal, and you can also catch his podcast, which is the Conduct Detrimental Podcast at Conduct Pod. Dan, thanks a bunch. We got to run because we're out of here for tonight, but thank you. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Andy. It was my pleasure to join you. Thanks.
There we go. Daniel Wallach at Wallach Legal joining us here on the Gresh Show on WPRO.